Marcus Turner had always believed in doing the right thing, even when it went unnoticed. A man of simple routines, he lived in Brooksville, a town where nothing much changed. His life was straightforward, working at the community center, helping fix things for his neighbors and keeping to himself. It was the kind of place where people lived quietly, and Marcus liked it that way. That evening was like any other. He was driving home from the center, the road bathed in the soft glow of dusk. The air was calm, the kind that made everything seem predictable, safe. But then, as Marcus rounded a bend in the road, something caught his eye. Up ahead, on the shoulder, was a car with its hazard lights blinking in the growing darkness. A woman stood next to it, pacing with visible anxiety. Marcus hesitated for just a second, but old habits kicked in. He pulled over. Helping people was part of who he was, no matter how small the problem. As he approached, the woman turned to face him, relief washing over her expression. She was in her late 20s, blonde, and clearly stressed. "Do you need help?" Marcus asked, already knowing the answer. "Yes," she replied, her voice trembling. "I have a flat and I don't know how to change it." Her name was Sarah Montgomery, though Marcus wouldn't learn that until later. In that moment, she was just someone who needed help, and that was enough. Marcus glanced at the tools and the spare tire she had pulled from the trunk. Without a word, he rolled up his sleeves and got to work. He'd done this enough times to make it second nature, though something about her urgency struck him as odd. Her eyes kept flicking toward the road, as if expecting someone, or something. But Marcus didn't ask questions. His focus was on getting the job done. As he worked, Sarah stood nearby, wringing her hands nervously. "Thank you for stopping. I've been out here for a while and no one else seemed to notice." Marcus tightened the last lug nut and stood up, brushing his hands against his jeans. "No problem. You're all set now. Just make sure to get the tire replaced as soon as you can." She smiled, though there was still tension in her eyes. "I will. I owe you for this." Marcus shook his head, dismissing her offer. "No need. Just glad I could help." But Sarah insisted, pulling out a wad of cash from her purse. "Please take it. I don't know what I would have done without you." Marcus took a step back, holding up his hands. "Really, I'm fine. I don't do this for money." Sarah hesitated, clearly wanting to push further, but she eventually relented, sliding the money back into her purse. "Thank you, Marcus," she said, her voice softer now. Marcus offered a quick nod and walked back to his truck, not giving much thought to the encounter. To him, it was just another good deed done, another person helped on the side of the road. But as he drove away, the image of Sarah's anxious pacing stayed with him, gnawing at the edges of his mind. Something about the way she kept looking over her shoulder, almost expecting trouble, didn't sit right. He shook the thought off. People got jumpy when things went wrong. She was probably just stressed from being stranded for so long. Marcus turned onto his street, ready to put the strange encounter behind him and settle into his usual quiet evening routine. But the feeling of unease lingered, even as he parked his truck and headed inside. Marcus had learned long ago to trust his instincts, and tonight they were telling him something wasn't quite right. The next morning, Marcus woke up with that same unsettled feeling from the night before. He chalked it up to the odd encounter with Sarah and tried to shake it off as he went through his morning routine. Coffee in hand, he stepped out onto his porch, breathing in the quiet stillness of the neighborhood. But as he looked out across the street, his eyes landed on something that made his heart skip a beat. Parked just a few houses down, where it hadn't been the day before, was a black SUV. It wasn't unusual to see different cars parked in the neighborhood, but something about this one felt off. It was too sleek, too polished for Brooksville. The windows were tinted, making it impossible to see who was inside, or if anyone was inside at all. Marcus's first instinct was to dismiss it, but as he stood there sipping his coffee, a gnawing suspicion crept in. The SUV didn't belong. Marcus shook his head, turning his attention back to the day ahead. He had things to do, work waiting for him at the community center, and worrying about a strange car wasn't going to get him anywhere. He finished his coffee, grabbed his keys, and headed out the door. But as he drove down the street, his eyes kept drifting toward the SUV in his rearview mirror. It hadn't moved, hadn't shown any sign of life, just sitting there, like a silent sentinel, watching. Marcus told himself he was being paranoid. People passed through town all the time. Maybe it was just someone visiting a neighbor. Still, the nagging feeling wouldn't leave him. By the time he arrived at the community center, Marcus had pushed the SUV from his mind, focusing on the familiar tasks of his job. He spent the morning fixing a leaky faucet, then helped set up chairs for an event later in the day. The work was mindless, the kind he enjoyed. Something about solving small problems gave him a sense of control, something he rarely needed to question. But as lunchtime approached, that sense of normalcy started to slip away. Marcus stepped outside to grab some fresh air, the sounds of the town around him blending into the background. But then he saw it again. Parked across the street, partially hidden behind a row of trees, was the black SUV. It was the same one from this morning. He was sure of it now. The same sleek design, the same tinted windows. His stomach tightened. What were the chances? Twice in one day, in two different places. Marcus leaned against the wall of the building, trying to calm the sudden rush of unease that swept over him. He wanted to believe it was just a coincidence, that maybe it was someone from out of town running errands or visiting friends. But deep down, he knew that wasn't true. The SUV hadn't followed him directly, but it was there, always on the periphery, as if its presence was intentional. For a long moment, Marcus debated what to do. Should he confront whoever was in the car, march up to the driver's window and demand to know what they were doing? The thought flashed through his mind, but his gut told him to hold back. It wasn't time yet. Instead, Marcus turned and went back inside, trying to shake off the feeling that he was being watched. He spent the rest of the day distracted, his mind drifting back to the black SUV every chance it got. Each time he glanced out the window, he half expected to see it there, waiting. But it didn't appear again, not that afternoon at least. As Marcus drove home that evening, he couldn't help but scan the streets, his eyes flicking from one car to another, searching for any sign of the SUV. By the time he turned onto his street, he was certain it was gone. But as he pulled into his driveway, his heart sank. There it was, parked at the far end of the street, barely noticeable unless you were looking for it, the same black SUV sitting quietly, as if it had never left. Marcus sat in his truck for a long moment, staring at the vehicle. It was just sitting there, unmoving, with no indication of who was inside. He didn't know what to make of it. Was it a coincidence? Or was something else going on? After a few minutes, Marcus shook his head, deciding not to dwell on it any longer. He had a choice: let his imagination run wild or go inside and live his life. He chose the latter, but as he locked his front door behind him, the feeling of being watched followed him inside. That night, Marcus slept fitfully, his mind racing with thoughts of the black SUV and the strange encounter with Sarah. He told himself it was nothing, that he was just overreacting. But deep down he knew something wasn't right, and whatever it wasn't going away. By the next morning, Marcus felt the weight of the previous 2 days pressing down on him. The black SUV was still lodged in his mind, and even though he hadn't seen it yet today, he couldn't shake the feeling that it was just a matter of time. He sat at his kitchen table, the morning light streaming in through the window, his untouched coffee growing cold beside him. Every few minutes he found himself glancing out the window, half expecting to see the SUV parked nearby. But it wasn't there. Not yet. Marcus took a deep breath and tried to push the thoughts away. He couldn't let this consume him. He had to focus on his day. The community center needed him, and people were counting on him to show up and get things done. Brooksville was a place of routines, and Marcus wasn't about to let something like a strange car disrupt his life. As he got ready to leave for work, he made a conscious effort to avoid looking for the SUV. He pulled out of the driveway and headed down the familiar roads. the tension in his shoulders gradually easing with each mile that passed. By the time he arrived at the community center, he had almost convinced himself that everything was normal. But normal didn't last long. It was mid-morning when Marcus caught sight of it again. The black SUV was parked across the street from the community center, just out of direct sight, but close enough that he couldn't ignore it. It was as if the car had become a shadow, always lurking, never too far away. Marcus stood by the window, staring at it, trying to decide what to do next. He was done pretending it wasn't happening. He was being followed, watched, and now he needed to figure out why. For a long time, Marcus stayed inside the building, watching the SUV from the corner of his eye. But no one got out, and no one approached him. It just sat there, a silent reminder that something was wrong. His thoughts drifted back to Sarah. Could this be connected to her? She had seemed nervous that night, always looking over her shoulder. But what could she have possibly been involved in that would lead to this? Finally, Marcus decided enough was enough. He wasn't going to sit around and wait for answers. He stepped outside, determined to confront whoever was in that SUV. His heart pounded as he crossed the street, the sun glaring down on him as he approached the car. But as he got closer, something unexpected happened. The SUV's engine roared to life. Marcus froze for a moment, watching as the vehicle smoothly pulled away from the curb and disappeared down the road. It was almost as if they had been waiting for him to make a move before slipping away. Frustration surged through him. He had been so close to confronting them, but now they were gone again, leaving nothing behind but more questions. Back at the community center, Marcus struggled to shake off the frustration. His day moved slowly, every task feeling heavier with the unanswered questions swirling in his mind. He tried to focus, tried to keep himself busy with the work in front of him, but the feeling of being watched never fully left him. It wasn't until later that afternoon that things took another strange turn. Marcus had left the center briefly to grab a sandwich from the local deli. As he walked back toward the building, the sandwich wrapped in paper in one hand, something caught his eye again. The black SUV. This time it wasn't across the street. It was parked much closer, just a few spaces down from his truck. Marcus stopped in his tracks, his pulse quickening. It felt deliberate now, like they wanted him to know they were there, whoever they were. Marcus approached his truck slowly, his eyes darting from the SUV to the street. His mind raced, torn between fear and frustration. He was tired of feeling cornered, tired of waiting for the other shoe to drop. He considered walking over to the SUV again, demanding answers. But something held him back. Something in his gut told him that whoever was behind this was playing a game he didn't understand yet. Instead, Marcus decided to head back inside. He would regroup, think things through before making any rash decisions. But just as he reached the steps of the community center, he heard the distinct sound of a car door opening behind him. Marcus turned, and for the first time, he saw someone step out of the black SUV. A man in a dark suit, tall and composed, stood by the vehicle. He wasn't familiar to Marcus, but his presence carried a weight that immediately set Marcus on edge. The man didn't approach right away. Instead, he stood there for a moment, watching Marcus with an unreadable expression. "Mr. Turner," the man finally said, his voice smooth and calm. "I believe we need to talk." Marcus tensed, his mind racing. Who was this man? And how did he know his name? "I don't know who you are," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Or what you want." The man smiled faintly, as if Marcus's response was expected. "I represent the Montgomery family. And trust me, Mr. Turner, you'll want to hear what I have to say." Marcus felt his pulse quicken at the mention of the Montgomery family. He had heard that name before. Sarah had mentioned it briefly, but he hadn't thought much of it at the time. Now, standing face to face with a man who had been watching him for days, Marcus realized that whatever this was, it was bigger than he'd anticipated. The man in the suit took a few steps closer, his calm demeanor unnerving. He extended his hand in a formal gesture, though Marcus didn't move to shake it. "My name is James Bennett," the man said, lowering his hand after a moment. "I work closely with the Montgomery family. They've asked me to speak with you, Mr. Turner. Marcus didn't respond right away. His mind was spinning with questions, but he didn't trust this man. Didn't trust the smoothness of his words, or the way he seemed too comfortable in the midst of all the tension. "Why have you been following me?" Marcus finally asked, his voice tight with frustration. Bennett raised an eyebrow as if the question was unnecessary. "We weren't following you. We were observing. There's a difference." Marcus's eyes narrowed. "I don't see the difference. What do you want from me?" Bennett sighed softly, as though he was dealing with someone who just didn't understand the complexities of the situation. "The Montgomery family values loyalty and integrity, Mr. Turner, and we believe you've demonstrated both in helping Sarah the other night. It's not often that someone steps up to assist in a moment of crisis without knowing the full weight of the circumstances." Marcus's jaw clenched. "I didn't know who she was or what any of this was about. I just helped someone who needed it." "And that," Bennett said, smiling faintly, "is why the Montgomery family would like to thank you. Properly." The way Bennett said it, properly, sent a chill down Marcus's spine. This wasn't just a simple thank you card or a handshake. There was something more to this, something deeper, and Marcus didn't like it. "I don't need anything from you," Marcus said firmly. "I didn't help her for a reward." Bennett's smile didn't falter, but there was a slight shift in his expression, something harder, more determined. "We understand that. But the Montgomerys aren't in the business of leaving debts unpaid. They take care of those who help them, whether those people want it or not." Marcus crossed his arms, trying to keep his voice steady. "I don't want anything. Just leave me alone." Bennett's eyes flickered with something unreadable. He took another step closer, his voice lowering slightly. "I think you misunderstand the situation, Mr. Turner. This isn't an offer you can simply walk away from. The Montgomerys have resources, power. They can make things very easy for you, or they can make things more difficult." The threat was clear, even if it was wrapped in polite words. Marcus felt his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't used to being cornered like this, wasn't used to feeling powerless, but he wasn't going to let Bennett push him around. "I don't want anything from your family," Marcus repeated, his voice firm, "and I don't need your help." Bennett studied him for a long moment, as if weighing his options. Then, with a small nod, he reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a business card. He held it out to Marcus, who hesitated before taking it. "Should you change your mind," Bennett said, his tone still polite but with an edge of finality, "you can reach us here. We'll be in touch, Mr. Turner. It's up to you how you want this to play out." Without waiting for a response, Bennett turned and walked back toward the black SUV. Marcus watched him, his mind racing with anger and confusion. He felt trapped, like he was being pulled into something he didn't understand, and now there was no easy way out. The black SUV pulled away, leaving Marcus standing alone outside the community center, the business card still clenched in his hand. He stared down at it, the weight of Bennett's words sinking in. The card was simple, just a name and a phone number in elegant script, no company name, no address. Marcus slipped the card into his pocket, unsure of what to do next. He didn't want any part of this, but it was clear now that the Montgomery family wasn't going to leave him alone. They had a way of making things happen, of pulling people into their orbit, and Marcus had no idea how deep it went. That night, as Marcus sat at home, the events of the day played over and over in his mind. He didn't know what kind of power the Montgomerys wielded, but it was clear that they weren't used to hearing the word no, and he wasn't sure how long he could keep refusing them before things got worse. As he sat in the quiet of his living room, Marcus's phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket, half expecting it to be Bennett again, or worse. But it wasn't. It was Sarah. The message was simple, just a few words, but they sent a chill down Marcus's spine. "We need to talk. They won't stop." Marcus stared at the message on his phone, feeling his chest tighten. He had hoped that maybe, just maybe, refusing Bennett's offer would make things stop, that the Montgomerys would move on to other matters, other people. But Sarah's message shattered that hope. They won't stop. The words echoed in his mind as he debated what to do next. He couldn't just ignore it. Sarah was trying to help, and whatever she had to say might be the key to understanding what was really going on. He quickly typed a response. "Where can we meet?" Sarah replied almost immediately. "I'll come to your place, tonight." Marcus put his phone down, his mind racing. He wasn't sure what to expect from this meeting, but it felt like things were about to escalate. He had seen how determined Bennett had been, and the thought of what the Montgomery family might do next made his skin crawl. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and darkness settled over Brooksville, Marcus paced in his living room, waiting for Sarah to arrive. He couldn't shake the tension that had built up over the past few days, the constant feeling of being watched, of things spiraling out of his control. Finally, a knock at the door. Marcus opened it to find Sarah standing on his porch, her face pale and drawn. She looked exhausted, her eyes dark with worry. Without a word, Marcus stepped aside and let her in. She walked into the living room, her movements stiff, like someone who had been carrying too much for too long. "Thanks for meeting me," Sarah said quietly, her voice strained. Marcus nodded, gesturing for her to sit down. "What's going on, Sarah? What did you mean when you said they won't stop?" She took a deep breath, her hands trembling slightly as she sat on the edge of the couch. For a long moment she didn't say anything, as if she was gathering the courage to explain. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "I didn't tell you the full story before," she admitted, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I didn't think it would go this far. But now I realize I can't keep hiding it." Marcus leaned forward, his stomach twisting with unease. "What is it? What's really going on?" Sarah looked up at him, her eyes filled with guilt. "My family, they're not just powerful, they're dangerous. My father, he's involved in things I never wanted to be a part of. But no matter how much I tried to stay out of it, they pulled me back in. And when you helped me that night, you got pulled in too." Marcus's pulse quickened. "Pulled into what exactly?" "Everything," Sarah said, her voice shaking. "The people my father works with, they're not just businessmen. They deal with things you can't imagine, illegal deals, threats, control. They use money and power to get what they want, and when that doesn't work, they use other methods. They think everyone has a price, and if they can't buy you, they'll find another way to control you." Marcus sat back, absorbing her words. He had suspected something bigger was at play, but hearing Sarah confirm it made his blood run cold. He had never imagined he'd get involved in something like this. "And now they think you're a part of this," Sarah continued, her voice barely steady. "They think you know something. That's why Bennett came to see you. He was trying to bring you in to make sure you stay quiet. And if you refuse, they'll make your life hell." Marcus clenched his fists, the anger and frustration boiling inside him. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner? I've been sitting here, trying to figure out what's going on, and you—" "I was scared," Sarah interrupted, her voice breaking. "I didn't want to drag you into this mess. I thought maybe if I kept my distance, they'd leave you alone. But I was wrong. I should have told you everything from the start. I'm sorry, Marcus." Marcus stood up, running a hand through his hair as he paced across the room. "What do they want from me? Why are they doing this?" "They don't want anything from you," Sarah said softly. "They want to control you, to make sure you don't interfere with whatever they're planning. My father's business deals, his connections, they're all dangerous. If you stand in their way, they'll treat you like a threat. And once they see you as a threat, they won't stop until you're out of the picture." Marcus stopped pacing, staring at Sarah. "What do I do? How do I make them stop?" Sarah looked at him with desperation in her eyes. "I don't know. They're not people you can reason with. They'll either buy you off or crush you. And if you don't play along, they'll find a way to ruin your life." Silence hung heavy in the air between them. Marcus could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, suffocating him. He had never asked for this. He had only wanted to help someone, to do the right thing. And now, it felt like the world was closing in on him. "You have to leave, Marcus," Sarah said suddenly, her voice urgent. "Get out of Brooksville. Go somewhere they can't reach you, at least for a while. It's the only way you'll be safe." Marcus stared at her, the words sinking in. Leaving Brooksville, his home, his life? The thought of running didn't sit well with him, but Sarah's fear was palpable. She was right about one thing. He couldn't stay here, not with the Montgomerys watching his every move. "Where would I even go?" Marcus asked, his voice thick with frustration. "Anywhere but here," Sarah replied. "Just lay low until things settle down. I'll try to figure out a way to help, but for now, you need to disappear." Marcus sighed, the weight of the decision pressing down on him. He didn't want to run, but what other choice did he have? "I'll think about it," he said quietly. Sarah nodded, standing up from the couch. "Just be careful, Marcus. They're not going to give up." As she walked toward the door, Marcus felt a sense of dread settle in his chest. He was being forced into a corner, and the options in front of him were becoming fewer by the minute. "Thanks, Sarah," he said as she opened the door, "for telling me the truth." Sarah paused in the doorway, looking back at him with a sad smile. "I just hope it's not too late." And with that, she was gone, leaving Marcus alone with the heavy weight of the choices he now had to make. The house felt eerily quiet after Sarah left. Marcus sat in the living room, his mind racing with everything she had told him. It was hard to believe that his simple act of kindness had thrown him into the middle of something so dangerous, so far beyond anything he'd ever imagined. The Montgomery family wasn't just wealthy. They were powerful in ways that made ordinary people like him feel insignificant. Marcus replayed Bennett's words in his mind. This isn't an offer you can simply walk away from. It had been clear from the start that refusing the Montgomerys wasn't a real option. They didn't make offers, they made demands. And they didn't like hearing the word no. As the hours ticked by, Marcus couldn't shake the growing sense of urgency. Sarah's warning echoed in his head. "You have to leave, Marcus. It's the only way you'll be safe." He hated the idea of running, but staying put seemed just as reckless. The Montgomerys had resources, connections, and influence, things Marcus couldn't fight on his own. He needed time to think, time to plan, and for that he needed to disappear. Before he could settle on a plan, his phone buzzed. For a moment he thought it might be Sarah again, but when he glanced at the screen, he felt a cold chill sweep through him. It wasn't Sarah. The message was from an unknown number, but the message was unmistakable. "We know you've been talking to Sarah. Be careful, Marcus. You don't want to get in over your head." His heart raced as he stared at the screen, his breath catching in his throat. They were watching him, not just from afar, but closely enough to know that Sarah had been there, closely enough to know every move he made. Marcus sprang up from the couch and went to the window, peering through the curtains. The street outside was quiet, still. There was no sign of the black SUV, but that didn't make him feel any safer. They could be anywhere, watching, waiting for the moment to close in. Suddenly, the walls of his house felt too close, too confining. Every sound, every shadow seemed to take on new meaning, and his pulse pounded in his ears. He couldn't stay here, not anymore. The message had made it clear. They weren't going to let him walk away from this easily. Grabbing a small duffel bag, Marcus hurried around the house, stuffing in clothes and essentials. His hands trembled as he zipped it up, his mind racing with all the things he was leaving behind, his life, his job, his home. But none of that mattered if he wasn't safe. He hesitated for a moment, standing in the doorway of his house. Leaving wasn't just about survival. It felt like giving up, like he was running away from the life he had worked so hard to build. But as much as he hated the idea, he knew there was no other choice. Just as Marcus slung the duffel bag over his shoulder, there was a knock at the door. His heart stopped. The knock wasn't loud or aggressive, just a soft, polite tapping, but it was enough to send a wave of dread crashing over him. Marcus froze, staring at the door, his mind scrambling to figure out what to do next. It was too late to pretend he wasn't home. Whoever was on the other side already knew he was there. The knock came again, this time more insistent. With a deep breath, Marcus moved toward the door, his hand gripping the knob tightly. He opened it slowly, just a crack, his heart pounding in his chest. Standing on his front porch was another man in a suit, similar to Bennett but younger, with a sharper edge to his expression. Behind him, parked at the curb, was the black SUV. The sight of it made Marcus's stomach drop. "Mr. Turner," the man said, his voice calm but firm. "My name is Turner. I believe you've already spoken with my colleague, Mr. Bennett." Marcus stared at him, his mind racing. Turner. The irony of the name wasn't lost on him, but there was no time to dwell on it. "What do you want?" Marcus asked, his voice tight. Turner smiled faintly, his eyes cold. "I think you already know. The Montgomery family values loyalty, Mr. Turner. They don't appreciate people who stray from the path." Marcus's grip on the door tightened. "I don't know what you're talking about. I haven't done anything." Turner tilted his head slightly, studying Marcus with a calculating gaze. "No, but you've spoken with Sarah. And that, Mr. Turner, is enough to raise concerns. We're simply here to remind you of the family's generosity. They've made you an offer it would be wise to accept." "I've already told Bennett, I don't want anything from your family," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. "I'm not interested." Turner's smile didn't waver, but there was a subtle shift in his tone, a hardening of the words that followed. Refusing an offer from the Montgomerys isn't as simple as saying no. It's not a decision to be taken lightly. The family has certain expectations, and when those expectations aren't met, there are consequences. The threat was clear, though spoken with a cold, professional detachment that made Marcus's skin crawl. He knew now that this wasn't just about money or gratitude. It was about control. The Montgomery family didn't take rejection well, and if he continued to resist, things were only going to get worse. "I'm leaving," Marcus said, forcing the words out. "I'm not getting involved in any of this." Turner's eyes narrowed slightly, but his smile remained. "You can leave, Mr. Turner, but don't think for a second that running will change anything. The family has a long reach. Wherever you go, they'll find you, and when they do, it might not be Mr. Bennett who comes knocking next time." Marcus's heart pounded in his chest, fear and anger swirling inside him. He knew Turner wasn't bluffing. The Montgomerys were too powerful, too connected. Running wouldn't save him, but staying meant living in their shadow, constantly looking over his shoulder. Turner stepped back, his smile fading into a look of cold finality. "We'll be in touch, Mr. Turner. I suggest you think carefully about your next move." And with that, Turner turned and walked back to the black SUV, leaving Marcus standing in the doorway, his mind reeling. As the SUV pulled away, Marcus felt a crushing sense of defeat. He had been given a choice, but it wasn't really a choice at all. The Montgomerys had made sure of that. No matter where he went, no matter what he did, they would be watching. The only question now was how long he could keep resisting before it all came crashing down. The next morning, Marcus felt like he was living in a different world. His home, once a place of peace and security, now felt like a cage closing in on him. He barely slept after the encounter with Turner, his mind too restless to find any comfort in sleep. The reality of his situation had hit hard. He couldn't just walk away from this. The Montgomerys weren't going to let him go so easily, and the idea of running suddenly seemed futile. As the sunlight crept through the curtains, Marcus sat at his kitchen table, his head in his hands. The duffel bag he had packed the night before was still sitting by the door, but now he wasn't sure what to do with it. Leaving had seemed like the best option, but Turner's words haunted him. "Wherever you go, they'll find you." The truth was sinking in. Running wouldn't solve anything. Marcus picked up his phone, his hands shaking slightly as he dialed a number he hadn't called in years. It rang several times before a familiar voice answered. "Marcus?" The voice on the other end was deep and steady, filled with concern. "It's been a while." "Hey, Derek?" Marcus replied, his voice thick with tension. "Yeah, it has. Listen, man, I need your help." Derek had been Marcus's best friend since childhood. but their lives had taken different paths over the years. Derek had moved to a bigger city, gotten involved in the business world, and they hadn't spoken as much as they used to. But Marcus knew he could trust him. If anyone could help him make sense of the situation, it was Derek. "Of course," Derek said without hesitation. "What's going on?" "It's hard to explain," Marcus began, trying to find the right words. "I've gotten involved with some people. Dangerous people. I didn't mean to, but now I don't know how to get out." "What do you mean, dangerous people?" Derek's voice grew serious. Marcus sighed, rubbing his temples. "The Montgomery family. They've been watching me, following me. I helped their daughter out of a bad situation, and now they're trying to pull me into their world. They've made it clear that saying no isn't an option." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. Marcus could hear Derek processing the information. "The Montgomerys?" Derek finally said, his tone laced with disbelief. "As in the Montgomerys who control half the state's businesses? Marcus, that's serious." "I know," Marcus replied, his voice strained. "That's why I'm calling. They won't leave me alone. I've told them I don't want anything to do with them, but they keep coming back, making threats." Derek was silent for a moment, and when he spoke again, his voice was softer. "I can't pretend to know what it's like dealing with people like that, but I do know one thing. Running isn't going to help. If the Montgomerys want something from you, they're not going to stop until they get it." Marcus nodded, even though Derek couldn't see him. He had been thinking the same thing. Running had always felt like a weak option, but now it was clear that it wouldn't be enough. "So what do I do?" Marcus asked, his voice tinged with desperation. "You've got to stand your ground," Derek said, his voice firm. "But you need to be smart about it. The Montgomerys operate with power and intimidation, but they're not invincible. They thrive on people's fear. If you can show them that you're not scared, that you're not going to let them control you, that might be your only shot." Marcus leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Derek was right. The Montgomerys had been pushing him because they thought he was weak, thought he would cave under pressure. But if he stood his ground, if he refused to be intimidated, maybe they would back off. Maybe. "And if they don't?" Marcus asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Then we'll figure something out," Derek said, his voice full of confidence. "You're not alone in this, Marcus. I'll help you however I can. But the first step is showing them you're not going to be bullied." For the first time in days, Marcus felt a small spark of hope. It wasn't much, but it was something to hold on to. He wasn't powerless, not completely. He had friends, people who cared about him, and that meant something. "Thanks, Derek," Marcus said, his voice soft but sincere. "I really appreciate it." "You don't have to thank me," Derek replied. "Just keep your head up. Don't let them get in your head. We'll get through this." They ended the call, and Marcus sat there for a long time thinking about what Derek had said. Standing his ground felt like the only option, but it also felt like walking a tightrope. One wrong move and everything could fall apart. Later that day, Marcus called his sister, Angela. She lived a few hours away, but they were close, and she had always been the level-headed one in the family. She listened patiently as Marcus explained the situation, her voice calm but concerned. "Marcus," she said gently, "this isn't something you can handle on your own. You need to have a plan." "I know," Marcus replied, "but I don't even know where to start. They've got money, power, and they can crush me if they want." Angela was silent for a moment. Then she spoke with quiet determination. "You can't let fear paralyze you. They're trying to intimidate you into submission, but you're stronger than that. You need to think carefully about your next steps, but whatever you do, don't let them see you panic." Marcus nodded, absorbing her words. It was easier said than done, but he knew she was right. Panicking wasn't going to solve anything. He needed to keep his wits about him and stay one step ahead. "Stay in touch with Derek and me," Angela continued. "We'll figure out a way to deal with this together." As the evening wore on, Marcus felt a strange mix of emotions: fear, hope, determination, and uncertainty. He knew the path ahead wasn't going to be easy, but he also knew he couldn't keep living in fear. If the Montgomerys wanted a fight, they were going to get one. The next morning, Marcus left his house with a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't running anymore. He was going to face this head-on, no matter what it took. Marcus walked out of his house with more resolve than he'd felt in days, but the weight of the Montgomery family's shadow still loomed large over him. Every step felt measured, every glance over his shoulder calculated. It was exhausting, but he knew now that running or hiding wouldn't work. He had to stand his ground, as Derek had said. The morning passed quietly, with Marcus trying to focus on the usual routine at the community center. But even in the mundane tasks, fixing a broken chair, setting up tables for an event, his thoughts kept drifting back to the Montgomerys. Turner's cold smile, Bennett's thinly veiled threats. They wouldn't just go away because he wanted them to. Mid-afternoon, as Marcus took a quick break outside the community center, his phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket, his stomach tightening when he saw the number. It wasn't saved in his contacts, but he recognized it instantly: Bennett. Marcus's first instinct was to ignore the call, to pretend like he hadn't seen it. But that wouldn't solve anything. The Montgomerys weren't the kind of people who gave up just because someone didn't pick up the phone. With a deep breath, he answered. "Mr. Turner." Bennett's voice came through, smooth as ever. "I hope I'm not interrupting your day." Marcus clenched his jaw, keeping his tone steady. "What do you want, Bennett?" There was a slight pause on the other end, as if Bennett was mildly amused by the question. "I'm calling to give you one final opportunity to reconsider our offer. The Montgomery family is nothing if not generous, but they don't like to be ignored." "I told you before," Marcus said, his frustration bubbling to the surface. "I don't want anything from your family." "Yes, you've made that abundantly clear," Bennett replied, his voice never losing its calm edge. "But I think you're failing to grasp the bigger picture. This isn't about what you want. It's about what's best for everyone involved, including you." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. He was tired of the cryptic language, tired of the threats dressed up as polite offers. "If I wanted your help, I would have taken it by now. I'm not going to change my mind." Another pause. This time, when Bennett spoke, his voice was colder, more direct. "You should understand, Mr. Turner, that refusing the Montgomerys is problematic. We don't make offers lightly, and when they are refused, it reflects poorly on the person refusing them. I don't think you want to find out what happens next." The threat was clear, and Marcus's hand tightened around his phone. He didn't know how far the Montgomery family's reach extended, but he had no doubt they had the power to make his life a living nightmare if they wanted to. "I'm not scared of you," Marcus said, though the words felt hollow as he spoke them. Bennett chuckled softly, a sound that made Marcus's skin crawl. "Fear isn't necessary, Mr. Turner. What's necessary is understanding. You can either accept our help and move forward with your life, or you can make this difficult. The choice is yours." Marcus stayed silent, his mind racing. He wanted to tell Bennett to leave him alone, to fight back, but he knew how dangerous the situation had become. He wasn't dealing with ordinary people. He was dealing with a family that had influence in every corner of the state, a family that could destroy his life with a single word. "Are you still there, Mr. Turner?" Bennett asked, his voice deceptively pleasant. Marcus took a deep breath. "I'm here." "Good," Bennett said. "We're giving you one last chance to do the smart thing. Take the offer, Marcus. It's not as complicated as you think. You'll get what you want, and the Montgomerys will get what they need." Marcus shook his head, even though Bennett couldn't see him. "What does that even mean? What do you want from me?" Bennett paused, as if considering how much to reveal. "We need someone with your skills. Someone with a clean reputation in Brooksville. You're well-liked, trusted by the community. That's valuable to us." "You're asking me to work for you?" Marcus asked, incredulous. "In a manner of speaking," Bennett replied. Think of it as a partnership. You help us maintain certain interests in the town, and we make sure your life gets a little easier. Financially, professionally, whatever you need. The Montgomery family takes care of its own. Marcus felt sick. They wanted to use him, to control him, just like they controlled everyone else. He had seen what happened to people who got involved in those kinds of deals. It started with favors, small compromises, and before long, there was no way out. "I'm not for sale," Marcus said firmly, his voice shaking with anger. "I never said you were," Bennett replied coolly. "But everyone has a price, Mr. Turner, whether it's for security, peace of mind, or something else. Think about it carefully. You have until the end of the week to make your decision." Marcus could feel the weight of Bennett's words pressing down on him, suffocating him. He didn't know what to say, how to respond. All he knew was that the Montgomerys weren't going to let him walk away without a fight. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be, Marcus," Bennett continued. "We're not unreasonable people, but we expect loyalty from those who work with us. The Montgomery family always rewards loyalty." Marcus swallowed hard, feeling the walls closing in on him. He didn't want to get involved, but Bennett was making it clear that refusing wasn't really an option. The Montgomerys didn't take no for an answer. "I'll think about it," Marcus said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Good," Bennett replied. "I look forward to hearing from you soon. Don't keep us waiting." With that, the call ended, leaving Marcus standing alone outside the community center, his mind spinning. The offer hadn't changed. It was still the same trap dressed up as a favor, but now Marcus understood just how dangerous the situation had become. He wasn't dealing with simple business people. He was dealing with a family that would stop at nothing to get what they wanted, and if he didn't play along, they were going to make sure he regretted it. As he stood there, staring at the phone in his hand, Marcus knew one thing for certain. Whatever decision he made, there would be no going back. After the call with Bennett, Marcus stood outside the community center for a long time, trying to gather his thoughts. The weight of the situation was suffocating, heavier than anything he'd ever dealt with before. The Montgomery family's reach was everywhere, and no matter how much he wanted to believe he could escape their grasp, the reality was sinking in. They were too powerful, too connected. The idea of leaving town had crossed his mind again, but Derek's words lingered in his head. "Running won't help. You need to stand your ground." But how could he stand his ground when he was up against people who could ruin his life with a single phone call? People who made others disappear if they stepped out of line. Marcus headed home, his hands clenched tightly around the steering wheel, mind racing through his limited options. As he turned onto his street, something caught his eye, an envelope tucked under the windshield wiper of his truck. His stomach sank. He had a feeling he already knew where it had come from. Parking in his driveway, Marcus grabbed the envelope cautiously. It was black, like the one before. Inside was a single sheet of paper, the message typed in the same bold, formal style as the others. "Your time is running out. We expect your decision by the end of the week. We don't make offers twice." The words sent a chill down his spine. He crumpled the paper in his hand and looked around, but the street was empty. No black SUV this time, no sign of anyone watching him. But he knew better than to think they weren't keeping tabs on him. Back inside his house, Marcus sat at the kitchen table, the crumpled note beside him. His duffel bag was still by the door, a reminder of the escape plan that now seemed pointless. He had nowhere to run, nowhere they wouldn't find him. And even if he did leave, what would stop them from targeting his friends, his family? Bennett had made it clear that the Montgomery family didn't forget. The days passed in a haze. Marcus tried to go about his normal routine, working at the community center, checking in with friends, but the weight of the Montgomerys' threat was always there, looming over him like a storm cloud. Derek called a few times to check in, offering advice and support, but even Derek didn't have an answer to the impossible question Marcus faced. Thursday evening arrived and Marcus still hadn't made a decision. The end of the week was approaching fast, and with every passing hour, The pressure mounted. He knew he couldn't put it off any longer. That night, as Marcus sat in his living room staring blankly at the television, his phone buzzed again. It was another message, this time from Sarah. "I'm sorry about all of this. I never wanted to drag you into it. Please be careful." Marcus read the message twice, feeling a mix of anger and guilt. Sarah had tried to warn him, but it hadn't been enough, and now the consequences of helping her were becoming clearer by the day. He didn't blame her, not entirely, but he couldn't help but feel frustrated by how everything had spiraled out of control since that night. He texted her back, keeping it simple. "I'll be careful. But this is getting worse." A few minutes later, Sarah replied, "If you need help, let me know. I'll do what I can." It was a kind offer, but Marcus wasn't sure how much Sarah could actually do. She was as much a pawn in her father's world as anyone else. The Montgomery family didn't bend to anyone's will, not even their own daughters. The following day, the day of the deadline, Marcus woke up with a feeling of dread. The weight of the decision loomed over him all morning, casting a shadow on everything he did. He went to work, but his mind wasn't on the tasks at hand. Every time his phone buzzed, he felt his heart jump, expecting it to be Bennett or Turner with another message. Finally, as the afternoon sun dipped lower in the sky, Marcus knew he couldn't delay any longer. He had to make a decision. The question wasn't just about accepting the Montgomery's offer. It was about what it would cost him if he did. Would he lose himself in the process? Could he live with the compromises they'd demand? Marcus paced his living room, running through every possibility, every scenario. He didn't want to give in. Everything in him screamed to resist, to stand his ground. But at what cost? If he refused, the Montgomerys wouldn't just walk away. They'd make his life hell. They might go after his friends, his family. He'd seen the way they operated, calculated, relentless. He stopped pacing and looked at his phone. Bennett's number sitting there like a weight in his contacts. His finger hovered over the screen, his mind a storm of conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to call, to tell Bennett to shove his offer where the sun didn't shine. But another part of him, more pragmatic, more fearful, knew that defiance would only bring trouble. After what felt like an eternity, Marcus lowered his hand. He couldn't make the call. Not yet. He needed time. Time to think. Time to figure out if there was another way out of this mess. But time wasn't something the Montgomerys were known for giving. Just as he set his phone down, it buzzed again, startling him. Another message, this time from Bennett himself. "Your decision is due by midnight. Don't make us come to you." Marcus stared at the message, his heart pounding. The clock was ticking and he was running out of options. Midnight wasn't far off, and if he didn't call them by then, the consequences would follow soon after. Taking a deep breath, Marcus walked out onto his porch, the cool evening air hitting his face. The street was quiet, the faint hum of crickets in the distance. For a moment, it almost felt like the old Brooksville he knew, peaceful, predictable. But that peace was an illusion. His entire life had been upended, and there was no going back to the way things were. As the evening wore on, Marcus knew he had to make a choice, and whichever path he chose, there would be no turning back. Marcus stood on his porch, the weight of the decision crushing him as the hours ticked by. The deadline loomed closer, and every passing minute felt like a step toward a cliff's edge. Midnight was only a few hours away, and the Montgomery family was waiting for his response. He felt trapped, cornered, with no way out. He had always been a man of simple principles: help people when they need it, stay out of trouble, and live a quiet life. But now, those principles seemed inadequate in the face of what was happening. He had helped someone, and it had landed him in the crosshairs of people who didn't believe in no. The idea of calling Bennett, of giving in, made his stomach turn. But the alternative? Marcus wasn't sure he could handle what came next if he refused. The cool evening breeze swept across his face, but it did little to calm his nerves. He pulled his phone out of his pocket and stared at it again. The deadline was closing in, and the pressure was unbearable. His mind churned through the same questions, the same doubts, over and over again. Could he really say no to people like the Montgomerys? Would refusing them ruin him, destroy everything he had worked for? Or could he live with himself if he gave in, became a pawn in their game? As he wrestled with the decision, Marcus heard footsteps approaching his house. He tensed, his eyes darting toward the sidewalk. A figure emerged from the shadows, Sarah. She looked exhausted, her face pale and drawn, but her eyes were filled with urgency. "Marcus," she said, her voice breathless. "I came as soon as I could. You didn't answer my messages." I don't know what to do, Sarah," Marcus said, his voice shaking slightly. "They're giving me until midnight. I feel like I'm out of options." Sarah walked up to him, her expression filled with concern. "I know. I've been trying to figure out a way to help, but my father, he doesn't listen to me. Once he sets his mind on something, it's almost impossible to stop him." Marcus shook his head, frustration rising in his chest. "I don't want to get involved in whatever this is, but if I say no, I don't know what they'll do. They've already made it clear that they won't take no for an answer." Sarah bit her lip, her eyes darting nervously. "I should have told you everything from the beginning. I didn't realize how far this would go, but now I think you're in danger." "Danger?" Marcus echoed, his heart racing. "My father isn't a patient man, and neither is Bennett," Sarah said, her voice low. "They don't make threats they won't follow through on. If you refuse them, they'll make an example out of you." The words hit Marcus like a punch to the gut. He had suspected it all along, but hearing it confirmed made it all the more terrifying. "I can't just give in," Marcus said, pacing back and forth. "I don't want to be a part of their world. I don't want to be owned by them." Sarah stepped closer, her voice soft but urgent. "You don't have to give in completely. You just need to buy yourself some time. Play along, make it seem like you're considering their offer. That might give us enough time to figure something out, a way to get you out of this." Marcus stopped pacing, turning to look at her. "And what if that's not enough? What if they see through it?" "I don't know," Sarah admitted, her eyes filled with fear. "But it's better than refusing them outright. If you give them a flat-out no, they'll see it as a direct challenge, and that's when things get dangerous." Marcus clenched his fists, the frustration boiling inside him. He had spent his whole life avoiding conflict, keeping to himself, and now he was being pushed into a corner with no way out. "Why are you even helping me, Sarah?" Marcus asked suddenly. "You could have walked away from this, kept me out of it." Sarah's face softened, her eyes filled with guilt. "Because you helped me when I was in trouble. You didn't have to, but you did. And now, I'm trying to make things right. I'm sorry, Marcus. I never wanted any of this." Marcus sighed, running a hand through his hair. The weight of the situation was overwhelming, but he knew Sarah was right. Refusing outright would be the worst decision he could make. He needed to find a way to buy time, to think of a plan that didn't involve handing his life over to the Montgomery family. "Okay," Marcus said finally, his voice steady but filled with reluctance. "I'll call Bennett. I'll tell him I'm considering the offer, but I need more time. That should keep them off my back for a little while." Sarah nodded, relief flashing across her face. "Good. That's the right move for now. It'll give us time to figure something out." Marcus pulled out his phone and scrolled to Bennett's number, his finger hovering over the screen. Every instinct in him screamed not to make the call, but he knew he had no other choice. The Montgomerys wouldn't wait forever. Taking a deep breath, Marcus pressed the call button. It rang twice before Bennett's voice came through, smooth and controlled. "Mr. Turner," Bennett said, "I was wondering when you'd call." Marcus swallowed hard. "I've been thinking about your offer. I'm not ready to make a decision yet, but I'm considering it. I just need a little more time." There was a brief silence on the other end, and for a moment Marcus thought Bennett might see through the bluff. But then, Bennett's voice came through, calm and measured. "Of course, Mr. Turner. We understand that these decisions require careful thought. Take the weekend. But remember, the Montgomery family values prompt decisions. We don't like to be kept waiting." Marcus nodded, even though Bennett couldn't see him. "I appreciate that. I'll be in touch," Bennett said, his tone dripping with control. "Enjoy your weekend, Mr. Turner." The line went dead, and Marcus lowered the phone, his heart pounding in his chest. He had bought himself a few days, but he knew it wouldn't last. Sooner or later, they would expect a real answer. Sarah exhaled, relief evident in her posture. "That should give us some time to figure things out." Marcus nodded, but the pit in his stomach remained. He had crossed a line by making that call, even if it was just to buy time. And now, more than ever, he understood just how dangerous this game had become. The weekend passed in a blur of tension and uncertainty for Marcus. Every hour felt like borrowed time, a temporary reprieve from the inevitable moment when the Montgomerys would come knocking again, expecting a decision. He spent most of the time trying to figure out his next move, but no matter which way he turned the situation, it all came back to the same crushing reality. There was no easy way out. He hadn't told Derek or Angela about the latest developments yet. What could he say? That he'd agreed to consider working for the Montgomerys just to buy himself time. It felt like a betrayal of everything he stood for, even though he knew there was no other choice. They would understand, but Marcus couldn't bear the thought of worrying them even more. By Sunday evening, the pressure was unbearable. Marcus couldn't stop thinking about the upcoming week, when Bennett would call again and expect a final answer. He could feel the noose tightening, and the thought of giving in, of letting himself be drawn into the Montgomery's world, made his skin crawl. But what other options did he have? That evening, Sarah called. "Have you made any progress?" she asked, her voice strained with concern. Marcus sat on his porch, staring out at the quiet street, wishing for the calm he used to take for granted. "No," he admitted. "I don't know what to do, Sarah. I bought some time, but it's running out, and I can't shake the feeling that whatever I choose, I'm going to lose." Sarah was silent for a moment, her breathing soft on the other end of the line. "I've been thinking too," she said finally. "There might be a way to protect you from my family, but it's risky." Marcus frowned. "What do you mean?" "My father doesn't trust me," Sarah said, her voice filled with regret. "He sees me as a liability. That's why he wanted to control you. He thinks I told you something important. He's paranoid. But if we can show him that you're not a threat, maybe we can convince him to leave you alone." "How do we do that?" Marcus asked, though he was already dreading the answer. Sarah hesitated. "You need to meet him, face to face. It's the only way. If you talk to him, show him that you're not a threat to his business, he might back off." Marcus's heart bounded. "You want me to meet your father? The man who's been sending Bennett to threaten me? That sounds like a terrible idea." "I know it sounds dangerous," Sarah said quickly. "And it is. But I know my father. He respects people who show strength, who don't back down. If you show him that you're not afraid, he might reconsider." "Might," Marcus repeated, his voice tinged with disbelief. "That's a pretty big risk, Sarah." "I know," she said, her voice softening. "But it might be the only way to get out of this without being trapped by them forever. I wouldn't suggest it if I didn't think it could work." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his mind spinning with the possibility. The idea of meeting the head of the Montgomery family, the man who was behind all of this, made his stomach churn with fear. But Sarah was right about one thing. It was a chance. Maybe the only one he had. "And what if it doesn't work?" Marcus asked, the fear obvious in his voice. Sarah hesitated. "Then you'll be in even more danger than before. But I'll be there. I won't let anything happen to you." Marcus sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He felt like he was standing at a crossroads with no clear path that didn't end in disaster. But what other option did he have? Running wouldn't solve anything, and continuing to delay Bennett would only make things worse. "Fine," Marcus said finally, his voice filled with resignation. "I'll do it. I'll meet your father." Sarah exhaled, clearly relieved. "I'll set it up. It'll have to be soon. Maybe tomorrow or the day after. I'll make sure you're not walking into anything dangerous." Marcus nodded, though his nerves were frayed. "Just let me know when." "I will," Sarah promised. "And Marcus, thank you." I know this isn't fair, but it might be the only way." They ended the call, and Marcus sat in silence, staring out at the fading light of the evening. He didn't know what to expect from the meeting, but the thought of facing the man who controlled so much power terrified him. Still, Sarah had offered him a way out, a slim chance, but a chance nonetheless, and it was better than continuing to wait for the hammer to fall. The next morning, Marcus woke up to another message from Sarah. It was brief but clear. "It's set. Tomorrow at 3. Bennett will pick you up." Marcus read the message 3 times, his heart pounding in his chest. It was happening. He was going to meet the head of the Montgomery family, the man who had been quietly pulling the strings behind everything. The rest of the day felt surreal. Marcus went through the motions at the community center, trying to keep himself busy, but his thoughts were consumed by the impending meeting. Bennett would come for him tomorrow, and by the end of that day, everything would change, one way or another. That night, Marcus couldn't sleep. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind replaying every scenario he could think of. What would he say? How would he convince the man not to destroy his life? And what if it went wrong? What if the meeting only made things worse? As the hours ticked by, Marcus felt the weight of it all pressing down on him. There was no going back now. The clock was ticking and his time was running out. The day had arrived. Marcus woke up feeling like his stomach had been twisted into knots. He moved through the morning in a haze, trying to prepare himself mentally for what was coming. The clock seemed to move faster than usual, each hour bringing him closer to the moment he would face the head of the Montgomery family. By the time the afternoon arrived, Marcus could barely sit still. He kept checking the clock, watching the minutes slip away. The message from Sarah had been clear. Bennett would pick him up at 3 o'clock, and there was no turning back now. At exactly 3 p.m., a familiar sound echoed outside Marcus's house, the low hum of the black SUV's engine. He looked out the window and saw Bennett stepping out of the vehicle, his calm, professional demeanor unchanged. This was just another day for Bennett, but for Marcus it felt like stepping into the lion's den. Taking a deep breath, Marcus grabbed his jacket and stepped outside. Bennett greeted him with a nod, his expression unreadable. "Mr. Turner," Bennett said smoothly, "I trust you're ready." "As ready as I'll ever be," Marcus replied, trying to hide the anxiety gnawing at him. Bennett didn't respond, simply opening the door of the SUV and gesturing for Marcus to get in. Marcus slid into the back seat, his heart pounding. The interior of the car was sleek, quiet, and smelled faintly of leather. Bennett climbed into the driver's seat and started the engine. The drive was long and silent, with Bennett saying nothing the entire time. Marcus stared out the window, watching as the familiar sights of Brooksville faded into the distance. They were heading out of town, farther than Marcus had ever gone before. He had no idea where they were going, but he knew it wasn't to any public place. The Montgomery family valued privacy, and this meeting would be no different. After what felt like an eternity, the SUV turned onto a long, winding driveway that led to a sprawling estate hidden behind tall iron gates. The house itself was massive, a testament to the wealth and power of the family that owned it. It was imposing, a place where decisions were made that affected people's lives in ways they couldn't even imagine. Bennett pulled the SUV up to the front entrance and parked. He turned to Marcus, his expression as calm and professional as ever. "Mr. Montgomery is waiting for you inside," Bennett said. "This is your chance, Mr. Turner. Make the most of it." Marcus swallowed hard, nodding as he stepped out of the car. His legs felt weak, but he forced himself to walk toward the grand front doors. The weight of what was about to happen pressed down on him, but he couldn't turn back now. This was his only chance to get out from under the Montgomery's grip, and he had to take it. The doors opened as Marcus approached, revealing a man standing in the foyer. He was older, in his late 60s, with sharp features and a presence that commanded respect. Marcus recognized him immediately. It was James Montgomery, the patriarch of the family, the man behind all of this. "Mr. Turner," Montgomery said, his voice deep and steady, "thank you for coming." Marcus nodded, feeling the tension rise in his chest. "I didn't think I had much of a choice." Montgomery smiled faintly, though there was little warmth in it. "There's always a choice, Mr. Turner. It's just a matter of making the right one." Marcus followed Montgomery into a large study, the walls lined with books and expensive artwork. The room was dimly lit, the atmosphere heavy with power and control. Montgomery gestured for Marcus to sit in one of the leather chairs across from his desk. Once they were seated, Montgomery leaned back in his chair, studying Marcus with cold, calculating eyes. "I understand you've been speaking with my daughter. Sarah seems to think you're not a threat to our family's interests. I'm here to find out if that's true." Marcus felt his pulse quicken. This was it, the moment he had been dreading. He had to tread carefully. "I'm not interested in your business," Marcus said, his voice steady. "I never wanted to be involved in any of this. I just helped Sarah when she needed it. That's all." Montgomery raised an eyebrow, his expression unreadable. "And yet, here you are, involved, whether you wanted to be or not." "I didn't ask for any of this," Marcus continued, trying to keep his composure. "I don't want anything from you or your family. I just want to go back to my life, to the way things were before." Montgomery was silent for a moment, his eyes narrowing slightly as he considered Marcus's words. "You think it's that simple? That you can just walk away from this?" "I think I've shown that I'm not a threat," Marcus said, his voice growing firmer. "I don't know anything about your business, and I don't want to. I'm just asking to be left alone." Montgomery leaned forward slightly, his gaze piercing. "I don't like loose ends, Mr. Turner, and you've become one." Marcus's heart raced, but he didn't flinch. "Then tie it up. Let me walk away, and you won't hear from me again." The room was silent for what felt like an eternity, Montgomery's gaze never leaving Marcus. Then, slowly, the older man leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," Montgomery said. "Most people in your position would have folded by now. But you're not like most people, are you?" Marcus didn't respond, unsure if Montgomery's words were a compliment or another veiled threat. "Very well," Montgomery said after a long pause. "I'll consider your request. But understand this, Mr. Turner. If I grant you the freedom you're asking for, there will be no second chances. If you cross me, if you so much as think about interfering in my affairs again, I will destroy you. Do you understand?" Marcus nodded, his throat tight. "I understand." Montgomery stood, signaling that the meeting was over. "Bennett will drive you home. I'll have my decision by the end of the week. Until then, keep your head down." Marcus stood, his legs weak with relief and fear. He had survived the meeting, but it was far from over. He had bought himself a little more time, but Montgomery's threat hung over him like a dark cloud. One wrong move and everything he had built would be gone. Bennett was waiting for him outside, his expression as unreadable as ever. "How did it go?" he asked as they got into the SUV. "I guess we'll find out," Marcus muttered, his mind still reeling from the conversation. The drive back to Brooksville was long and quiet, with Marcus replaying every word of the meeting in his head. He had faced the lion, and for now he had survived, but he knew that the battle wasn't over yet. Montgomery was a man of his word, and if Marcus slipped up, there would be no mercy. As they pulled up to his house, Marcus stepped out of the SUV, his body exhausted from the tension of the day. Bennett nodded to him once before driving away, leaving Marcus alone on the street. He stood there for a long time, staring at the quiet neighborhood around him, wondering if things would ever feel normal again. The weight of the Montgomerys still hung over him, but for the first time, he felt like there might be a way out. All he had to do now was wait, and hope that Montgomery's decision would let him walk away from this nightmare once and for all. If you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to my channel. I work hard on these stories, and your support means a lot to me. Thank you for being part of this journey.